Edward Langston had already accepted death. Alone, injured, and surrounded by predators, he thought this would be the end. But what he didn't expect, what no one could have predicted, was that his life would be saved by a boy who had nothing. No family, no home, just a loyal dog and the courage to face down danger without blinking. That boy was Marcus, and neither of them knew it yet, but this wasn't just a rescue. It was the start of a connection that would shake both of their worlds, because hidden behind the boy's silence was a truth tied to Edward's deepest wound, a tragedy they both shared, without even knowing it. This is not a story about luck. It's about choices, secrets, and the power of being seen. Stay with us until the end, because when the past finally comes to light, no one will be the same. And before we begin, let us know, where are you watching from? Edward grunted as his left boot sank into the uneven slope, the soft mud giving way beneath his weight. He cursed under his breath and grabbed at the nearest tree trunk to keep from tumbling forward. The cane he used back at the house had been left leaning against the kitchen counter, forgotten in a fit of pride. He told himself he didn't need it anymore, that he was stronger this morning, but now his knee burned with every step. He pushed through the thick underbrush, ignoring the sharp sting of dried branches scraping against his palms. Every movement felt heavier than it should have, like his body was betraying the resolve he'd forced himself to carry since the accident. As he climbed further down the slope behind the north paddock, his breath grew shorter. He wasn't out here for exercise. He wasn't out here for air. He was looking for a place where his son had once carved initials into a stone, a childhood spot Edward hadn't thought about in 30 years. But when his foot slid and he fell hard onto the rocks, the sudden crack in his hip silenced everything inside him except one pure, final thought. This is how it ends. The pain arrived before the fear. It radiated from his side, like a white-hot rod had been shoved under his skin. He tried to move, but the grinding sensation in his hip made his vision dim. Sweat poured down his face as he clenched his jaw and attempted to crawl. One arm stretched forward, trembling, dragging his body a few inches through the dirt and dead leaves. He tried to reach into his back pocket for the phone, but it was gone, maybe lost in the fall. He couldn't remember dropping it. "God damn it," he muttered, breath ragged. His hearing buzzed, and when he paused to listen, hoping, praying for a sound of rescue, what he heard instead was something else rustling, quick, low to the ground, then again, closer. He twisted just enough to catch movement behind the brush, shadows shifting, eyes glinting yellow. A low growl vibrated the air. Coyotes, 3 of them, lean, alert, and focused. He didn't dare move. The largest one stepped forward, lips curled, teeth exposed. Edward tried to yell, to wave his arms, but the pain held him hostage. And he knew then, in a way he hadn't before, not during the funeral, not during the nights alone, that this was truly the end. The lead coyote advanced a few feet, paws silent on the broken twigs, head lowered, body coiled. Edward's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The 2 others began to spread, flanking him, cautious but hungry. His hand reached instinctively for anything, a stick, a rock, even a clump of dirt, but his fingers found nothing but brittle leaves. His breaths became shorter, sharper, his heart hammering with each second. He thought of Charles, his boy, his face, right before he'd left for college, how he always bit the inside of his cheek when trying not to cry. The image gutted Edward more than the pain. He couldn't die like this, not alone, not like meat in the dirt. But then, without warning, the silence shattered. A loud bark cut through the air, followed by rapid crashing through the trees. The coyotes froze. One turned. Another took a cautious step back. Then the sound came again, closer, snarling, growling, something feral and alive. A blur of brown and white. burst into the clearing, teeth bared, leaping at the nearest predator. The pack scattered in confusion. The big one hesitated a second longer, but a sharp stone whipped through the air and struck its side. The animal yelped and fled. Edward, barely conscious, saw the silhouette of a boy standing, tall beside the dog. The boy couldn't have been older than 9, black, small for his age, face streaked with dirt and something like blood. His shirt hung in tatters, and his jeans were more holes than fabric. In one hand, he gripped a jagged branch. The other rested on the scruff of the mutt that had charged at the coyotes without hesitation. "You okay?" the boy asked, voice rough like he hadn't used it in a while. Edward tried to answer, but a cough tore through him instead. The boy took a cautious step closer. "You got bit?" Edward shook his head slowly. "Hip," he rasped. "Can't move." The boy knelt beside him, inspecting the leg with a grimace. "That's bad. Real bad." His fingers worked quickly, checking for bleeding, pressure, sensitivity. Rusty kept him off. "He's good like that. You lucky." Edward looked at the dog, which now sat a few feet away, panting but alert. "What's your name?" Edward asked. The boy didn't answer right away. "Marcus," he said eventually. "You alone out here?" Edward asked, already knowing the answer. Marcus didn't nod or shake his head. He just looked away. Then, almost to himself, he muttered, "Always." Marcus stood up and scanned the tree line. Then back at Edward. "You can't walk?" he asked. Edward barely managed a grunt. "Right," Marcus said, and exhaled slowly. "Okay, I can go get someone." He took a step, but Edward's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't leave," he said, voice shaking. Marcus blinked, surprised. "I'm coming back, I swear." "No," Edward whispered. "You're all I've got." Marcus hesitated, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he sat down again. "Then we figure it out," he said. For the next several minutes, Marcus tried to build a sling from his shirt and a belt he'd found abandoned in the underbrush, but it was useless. He looked toward Rusty. "Think you can pull something?" he asked. The dog cocked his head. "Didn't think so." He stood again. "There's a shack, not far. I saw it. Might be yours. I'll find a cart or something." Edward gripped his wrist again, tighter this time. "If you don't come back—" "I will," Marcus said and pulled free. "You saved me," Edward said, barely audible. "No one saves anyone," Marcus muttered as he vanished into the trees. Alone again, Edward fought to stay awake. The pain pulsed in waves and the sweat chilled his back. He stared at the spot where the boy had vanished, half believing he might never see him again. The forest grew quiet again, too quiet. He thought about his estate, empty, lifeless. The years he'd spent building a company, building a name, only to end up forgotten by the world, wounded in the dirt, waiting on a child. And the mutt to determine whether he lived or died. A bitter laugh escaped his lips, but it came out more like a sob. He closed his eyes and tried not to think about the way the largest coyote had stared at him, how it had already decided he was weak. Prey. Something to be taken. He thought of Charles. How he used to call his father invincible. The word hit like a bullet now. Edward wanted to believe Marcus would come back, but in the back of his mind the voice whispered, "Why would he? What does he owe you?" It was nearly an hour later, though it could have been minutes or days, when he heard it. Wheels, squeaking, rusted, a shuffle of hurried feet. Edward turned his head painfully and saw Marcus pushing a rust-covered wheelbarrow through the brush, Rusty trotting beside him. "Told you I'd come back," the boy said, panting. "You're heavier than you look." With difficulty and many grunts of effort, Marcus managed to drag Edward into the wheelbarrow, cushioning him with an old blanket he'd taken from the shack. The trip back was agonizing. Every bump made Edward groan in pain, but he didn't complain. Marcus talked the entire way, mostly to keep Edward conscious. "My mum's good with Dogs. That's why Rusty listens. He don't trust nobody but me. Edward tried to respond, but could only listen. She says we're ghosts, Marcus continued. Invisible people. People no one sees. The boy stopped, adjusted the load, and pushed forward. But you saw me, he said. Even bleeding and broken, you saw me. They reached the cabin at dusk. Marcus dragged the wheelbarrow over the steps with every ounce of strength his body could give. Inside, he laid Edward down near the fireplace and ran to gather kindling. It took 3 matches, but soon a flame flickered to life. Better, Marcus said, wiping sweat from his brow. He poured water from an old thermos into a cracked cup and lifted it to Edward's lips. Don't die, okay? He said quietly. You ain't allowed. Edward drank slowly, then reached out and touched the boy's arm. You're not a ghost, he said, voice hoarse. You're real. Marcus blinked, unsure how to respond. The dog curled up beside Edward, placing its head on the old man's arm. Marcus sat against the wall, knees pulled to his chest. The boy watched the flames rise and fall and whispered to the dog, I think we just changed everything. You're awake, Marcus said without looking up. He sat cross-legged on the wooden floor near the fireplace, carefully sharpening a stick with a small pocket knife. Rusty was curled beside him, eyes half closed but alert. Edward tried to sit up but winced immediately, his body reacting with stiff resistance. The pain was deeper now, less sharp, more pervasive, like it had seeped into his bones overnight. I wouldn't move too much, Marcus added. You probably cracked something. Maybe your hip. Edward leaned his head back against the cushion Marcus had wedged beneath him earlier. How long? Have I been out? He asked, voice raspier than before. Almost a whole day, Marcus replied, now glancing over. You were moaning in your sleep. Fever kicked in, but it's down now. Edward studied the boy in silence. His clothes were still torn, his shoes mismatched and held together by tape, and his face bore a layer of dirt that no child should carry, but his hands moved with calm, deliberate rhythm, and his voice had a steadiness that didn't match his age. You shouldn't still be here, Edward muttered. You saved me. That was enough. Marcus stopped what he was doing. Maybe it was. Enough for you, he said, but not for me. The room smelled faintly of smoke and antiseptic. Marcus had found a bottle of rubbing alcohol in the bathroom cabinet and used it to clean the small cuts on Edward's arms and face. That stuff stings, he had warned before pouring it without ceremony. Better than infection, though. Now Edward watched him with uneasy curiosity. Where did you learn all that? He asked. From TV and shelters. You pick things up if you don't want to die, Marcus answered. His voice wasn't bitter. It was flat, like a fact he no longer questioned. And your parents? Where are they? Edward asked. Marcus turned back to the stick in his hands. Mum's around, somewhere. She drops me off places sometimes when it gets too crowded where we sleep. Says it's safer that way. Edward frowned. You're alone? Marcus nodded once. Most of the time. The boy stood and walked toward the tiny kitchen area, rummaging through cabinets. You got canned soup, not the best, but better than nothing. He held up a dented can and a manual opener. You allergic to anything? Edward almost laughed, but the ache in his ribs made it hurt. No, Marcus nodded. Good, 'cause this is all there is. Rusty perked up when the can opened with a pop, tail thumping softly. Marcus split the soup between a plastic bowl for the dog and a chipped ceramic one for Edward. You don't want any? Edward asked as Marcus handed it over. I ate last night. Found some crackers in a drawer. Edward noticed how Marcus's eyes didn't quite meet his as he spoke. The boy had clearly eaten nothing but dry food in days, maybe weeks. You could have taken anything from this house, Edward said slowly. You could have left me on that trail and walked away with whatever you wanted. Marcus sat back down and shrugged. Didn't need anything, just didn't want you to die. Edward stared at him, confused by the bluntness. Why not? Marcus looked at Rusty, then back at Edward. "Because you saw me." The simplicity of the sentence hit harder than anything the boy had said before. "Most people don't. They cross the street or act like I'm a ghost. You looked right at me even when you were dying. That's rare." Edward swallowed slowly, unable to find the right words. Gratitude felt too small, guilt too heavy. All he could do was nod and finish the soup, spoon trembling slightly in his hand. Later that morning, Marcus helped Edward use the bathroom, their interactions stripped of all embarrassment by necessity. Edward hated how vulnerable he felt, but Marcus was unbothered, methodical, even patient. "We need crutches or something," the boy muttered, inspecting a nearby broom. "Unless you want to ride in that wheelbarrow again." Edward groaned. "I think I'd rather crawl." Marcus cracked a rare smile. "You wouldn't get far." He moved to the window and peeked outside. "No one's out there. Place is real empty. No neighbors. 10 miles to the next ranch," Edward said. "I wanted it that way." "Why?" "Too many people asking questions I didn't want to answer." Marcus looked at him for a long time. "Like what?" Edward didn't respond. He adjusted the blanket over his legs and looked away. "You lost someone," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Edward's jaw tightened. A son, Charles. Drunk driver took him." Marcus nodded slowly. "That why you came out here? To remember him, or forget? I'm still not sure." Marcus didn't press further. "He your only kid?" "Yes," Edward replied. "Then I guess you understand what it's like. To be the only one left." The sentence lingered between them, two truths colliding in the silence that followed. When the sun had shifted enough to bring light across the living room floor, Marcus began pulling supplies from cabinets, organizing them like a seasoned survivalist. "You got enough food for a few days," he said. "After that, we'll need to figure something out. You got money, right?" Edward raised an eyebrow. "A little." "Like cash?" "No, bank." Marcus rolled his eyes. "That's not gonna help if we need to go into town. You can't even stand up and I don't have an ID." Edward blinked. He hadn't thought about that. Marcus walked to the coat rack, grabbed the old hat Edward always ignored, and dropped it in his lap. "Disguise," he said. "If we need to take you out of here, people ask less questions when you look like just another old man." Edward chuckled. "You think this is the first time I've needed help?" Marcus stared at him. "I think it might be the first time you accepted it." Edward looked at the boy again, really looked, and saw not just a child, but someone who had already lived too many lives. And yet, despite it all, he stayed. Not for food, not for shelter, but maybe, just maybe, because Edward had finally looked at him, and not through him. In the afternoon, Marcus suggested they try moving Edward to the bedroom. "You'll rest better," he said. With Rusty's leash tied to the wheelbarrow, the three of them managed to half-lift, half-slide Edward across the house. Each jolt sent sparks of pain up his spine, but he didn't complain. Not once. When they finally got him onto the bed, Edward collapsed back against the pillows, sweat clinging to his skin. Marcus sat on the floor beside him, legs crossed, flipping through an old newspaper he'd found under the couch. "You used to be somebody," he said after a moment. "What makes you say that?" Edward asked. "You got a big house, expensive watch, stuff's all real. People like you don't just live in the middle of nowhere unless they're hiding." Edward exhaled slowly. "I was somebody. Now I'm just trying to be someone else." Marcus nodded. "You ever think maybe that's the best part?" Edward tilted his head. "Starting over, being someone else, not Mr. Langston, the guy on the news. Just Ed, some old man who got lucky enough not to die." Edward let the words settle. Maybe the boy was right. Maybe this moment, this second chance, was the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but both desperately needed. That evening, while Edward rested in the room, Marcus stepped outside with Rusty. He didn't wander far, just to the edge of the porch. where the ground dipped toward the creek bed. He crouched low, watching the distance as the dog sat beside him. "You think he's going to be okay?" Marcus whispered. Rusty gave a low grunt, tail flicking once. Marcus reached over and scratched behind his ear. "Yeah, me too." For the first time in weeks, the boy didn't feel the need to run. He had places he could go, shelters he could hide in, underpasses where no one asked questions. But this wasn't just shelter. This was different. The old man had looked at him like he mattered, like he wasn't just some blur in the corner of society's vision. That mattered more than food, more than safety. It was something he hadn't felt in years, being seen. He looked back at the cabin. A light flickered in the window. Edward was still awake, maybe thinking about his son, maybe thinking about Marcus. Either way, the boy knew something had changed, and no matter how long it lasted, he wasn't going to walk away. Not yet. "I want you to find the boy," Edward said, gripping the edge of the kitchen table as Jorge Molina stood frozen in the doorway. The ex-foreman hadn't seen his old boss in almost 2 years, not since Edward had shut down most of the staff and retreated into solitude. Jorge was shorter now, or maybe it was just the years that had finally caught up to him. His hair was white around the ears, and his jacket was threadbare. But his presence was steady, grounded. "What boy?" he asked cautiously. "The one who saved me," Edward replied. "His name's Marcus, maybe 9 or 10, black, skinny, with a dog." Jorge blinked. "You've been out here alone for years, Ed. You sure this wasn't—" "He's real," Edward snapped, slamming his palm down. "He dragged me out of the woods and kept me alive. He's not a hallucination." Jorge nodded slowly. Okay. You got anything else to go on?" Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small scrap of paper, a crude drawing Marcus had made before leaving. It showed a stick figure with a dog next to an old cabin, and the words, "Not dead yet," scribbled in shaky handwriting. Jorge stared at it. "All right," he said. "I'll start asking around." The city nearest to Edward's property, a tired and aging town called Harlan's Rest, had never been known for generosity. Its shelters were overcrowded, and the few churches that still offered food did so with side eyes and sermons. Jorge walked its streets for 2 days, asking questions in diners and gas stations, flashing the drawing to anyone who didn't immediately shoo him away. "A kid with a dog," one gas attendant muttered. "Sounds like the one that sleeps behind the auto garage, shows up when it rains, scares easy." Jorge followed that lead and found a flattened cardboard box under a metal awning soaked with motor oil and rain residue. No sign of Marcus. But in the nearby alley beside a dumpster, he found a tattered sock stuffed with crackers and a child's shoe half covered by a tarp. When he asked the garage owner, the man spat out his chew and shrugged. "We don't keep track of strays," he said. Jorge's gut twisted. He returned to Edward on the 3rd morning with little more than fragments, but it was enough. "He's in town. He moves a lot, but he's there," Jorge said, standing in the doorway again. Edward, seated in the living room with his cane across his lap, looked up. "Then take me." The ride into Harlan's Rest was slow, uncomfortable, and full of silences that neither man tried to fill. Edward insisted on going himself, despite Jorge's warnings. "He won't trust me," Edward had said. "He needs to see that I came." They stopped at a church kitchen around noon, where volunteers were handing out paper bags of food. Edward asked to speak to whoever kept track of the kids. A woman named Marion, round-faced with heavy glasses and an apron that smelled like cabbage, studied him suspiciously before nodding. "There's a boy, comes around twice a week, quiet, has a mutt. He took a sandwich Tuesday and left a crayon drawing on the bench." She dug into a drawer and handed over a page torn from a coloring book. It showed a stick dog sitting next to what looked like an old man in a bed, with shaky lines forming a wheelbarrow beneath them. Edward stared at the drawing, heart pounding. "That's him," he said. Marion's eyes softened slightly. "He doesn't stay long. If you see him, don't spook him. Kids like that, they vanish if you blink." Edward nodded. "I'm not here to scare him," he said. "I just need to see him again." They found Marcus 3 blocks away, sitting, cross-legged behind a bakery's trash bins, breaking apart a stale croissant and feeding half to Rusty. His back was to the street, his hoodie pulled over his head, but Edward recognized him instantly. Jorge stopped the truck at the corner. "Let me approach first," Edward said, gripping the door. "Handle. You can't even walk straight," Jorge reminded him. "Then let him see that," Edward snapped. He stepped out slowly, leaning on the cane, making no sudden movements. Marcus looked up the second Edward came into view. His eyes widened. He didn't run, but his body tensed. Rusty stood too, ears perked, growling low. "It's me," Edward said, "from the cabin, from the woods." Marcus didn't answer. "I just wanted to thank you." Properly. The boy's shoulders didn't relax. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Because you left," Edward said, "and I didn't get the chance to say what I needed to." "You?" "Didn't need to say anything," Marcus muttered. "You lived. That's enough." "Not for me," Edward replied, "and not for someone who saved a stranger without asking for anything in return." The boy looked down. Rusty stopped growling. Marcus didn't answer right away. He picked up another crumb and tossed it to the dog, his eyes darting between Edward and the exit behind the bakery. "What do you want?" he asked. "To take you back," Edward said. "To the cabin. Just for a while. You can leave any time you want. You and Rusty. I'll give you a room, hot meals, a bed that isn't on pavement." Marcus let out a dry laugh. "People always offer that. Then they take things away when you mess up." "I won't," Edward replied firmly. "I don't want anything from you. I just don't want you out here alone again." Marcus stood slowly, brushing crumbs from his jeans. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. He looked at Rusty, who wagged his tail, then back at Edward. "You sure?" Marcus asked. "Because I come with baggage. My mom's gone. People ask questions, and I don't do chores or pray before meals." Edward smiled. "Then you'll fit in perfectly." Marcus tilted his head, trying to read the man. Finally, with a short sigh, he said, "One night, just to eat and shower. Then we'll see." Edward nodded. "That's more than enough." Together, they walked back toward the truck. The drive back to the cabin was quiet, except for Rusty occasionally licking Marcus's hand. Jorge kept his eyes on the road, while Edward leaned his head back, relief washing over him. In the rear seat, Marcus stared out the window, still alert, still guarded. "You really live out here all by yourself?" he asked eventually. "I used to," Edward said. "Until you." Marcus didn't reply. When they reached the house, Edward struggled to climb the steps, and Marcus surprised everyone by moving to his side without being asked. He didn't offer to carry him, but he positioned himself close, steady, like a spotter. Inside, Jorge prepared a basic dinner while Marcus showered, emerging in clothes a few sizes too big, but clean. "You keep kid clothes around?" he asked suspiciously. "They were in storage," Edward lied. "You'd be surprised what people leave behind." Marcus didn't challenge it. He ate quickly, Rusty at his feet, eyes brighter than before. After dinner, Edward showed him the spare bedroom. "No locks," Marcus noted, looking at the door. "You can leave it open," Edward replied. "You're not trapped." The boy sat on the bed, testing the mattress. "Still just one night," he said. "That's fine," Edward answered, though he hoped it wasn't. Edward sat on the front porch that night, staring out at the horizon while Jorge cleaned up inside. His hip still throbbed, but the pain had dulled beneath something deeper, something like purpose. Marcus's backpack sat by the door, battered and overstuffed. It looked too small to hold the weight the boy carried. Jorge joined him, handing over a glass of water. "He's smart," Jorge said. Sharp too, but scared as hell. Wouldn't you be? Edward replied. I pushed everyone away. I built this place like a tomb. He walked into it like a stray and still tried to save me. Jorge nodded. That kind of kid doesn't come around often. Edward didn't speak. In for a while. Then he said, his mom's missing. He didn't say it, but I can feel it. She's out there and something's wrong. Jorge looked over. You want to find her too? Edward tightened his grip on the cane. Not yet. First, I want him to know this place isn't going to vanish on him. Not like everything else has. Jorge nodded again. Then you better start building more than a bed. Edward watched the door. Inside, Marcus was already asleep, Rusty curled at his feet. That's exactly what I intend to do, he whispered. Why do you keep staring at me? Marcus asked, without looking up from the cereal bowl in front of him. Edward, seated across the table, lowered his cup slowly and set it down without answering right away. Just trying to understand you, he said eventually. Marcus scoffed and kept eating. Most. And people try to fix me first. Edward didn't smile. I'm not most people. The boy paused, spoon midair, then shoved another bite into his mouth and chewed with the kind of urgency that betrayed how unfamiliar he still was with reliable food. Rusty sat beside him on the floor, tail flicking in idle contentment, licking his paw with calm indifference. Edward watched the way Marcus occasionally dropped bits for the dog without drawing attention to it. Every small movement between them was synchronized in a language unspoken. When Marcus rose from the table and opened the back door to let Rusty out, the dog didn't even need a command. He stayed close, orbiting the boy like a shadow. Edward pushed himself to his feet and followed them. We're going to check the fencing, he announced. Marcus didn't protest. He grabbed a small tool belt that Jorge had adjusted to his size and followed the old man out to the field. They walked in silence for several minutes, stepping over patches of cracked dirt and weeds that had grown wild along the edge of the western paddock. Marcus walked with his eyes low, focused, hands tucked into his hoodie. Rusty darted back and forth ahead of them, always within sight, occasionally circling back to brush against Marcus's leg before shooting forward again. Edward noted the way the boy would click his tongue softly to keep Rusty close, a sound barely audible, but effective. He listens to you, Edward observed. We've been together a long time, Marcus said. He listens 'cause he's had to. Edward stopped at a broken section of fencing, dropped to one knee with difficulty, and began inspecting the damage. Marcus knelt beside him and pulled out a pair of pliers. You ever do this before? Edward asked. Marcus nodded. Shelters always had fences. They always needed fixing, never had enough adults to do it. Edward raised an eyebrow. You fixed fences at shelters? Marcus shrugged. Nobody made me. Just got tired of watching stuff fall apart. The two worked side by side for nearly an hour, Marcus asking short questions about tools, Edward offering quick instructions. They said little else, but something settled between them, practical, steady, unforced. Later that day, Edward stood by the porch railing as Jorge wheeled in another load of supplies. He's different when he works, Edward said quietly. Jorge grunted. He's different, because he feels useful. Kids like that don't get to feel needed often. Edward nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He had watched Marcus for days now, how the boy never wasted movement, how his eyes constantly scanned the space around him, how his hand always touched Rusty's back when they paused. Somewhere new. He was quiet, yes, but never passive. Edward began noticing the way the boy rearranged items in the kitchen without asking, placed clean towels in the bathroom without being told, and turned off lights when Edward forgot. He doesn't wait to be invited, Edward murmured aloud. He just adapts. Jorge dusted his hands off and stepped beside him. You thinking about making this permanent? Edward didn't answer immediately. I don't know what I'm thinking, he replied. But I do know this house feels less like a coffin now. Jorge didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth tugged upward slightly. "Might be time to put that guest room to better use," he said before heading inside. Edward remained on the porch, watching Marcus and Rusty disappear down the trail together. That evening, Edward brought out an old chessboard and set it on the kitchen table. "Ever played?" he asked. Marcus looked at the board like it might bite. "No," he replied. "Want to learn?" Edward asked. The boy shrugged. "I guess." Edward taught him the basics, how the knight moves in an L, how the bishop stays on one color, how the queen is the most powerful piece. Marcus listened quietly, brow furrowed, eyes following each motion with laser precision. He didn't speak much during the first game, but picked up patterns fast. By the second, he was predicting Edward's moves. By the third, he'd trapped Edward's queen. "You've got good instincts," Edward said, genuinely surprised. "I watch people a lot," Marcus replied. "Chess is just watching rules." They played until the pieces started to blur in the dim kitchen light, and Marcus finally said, "We should go to bed." Edward agreed, collecting the pieces and placing them back into the carved wooden box. As Marcus turned to leave, he paused and looked back. "Thanks for not making it weird," he said. "Most adults get weird when they try to be nice." Edward didn't know how to reply, so he just nodded. That night, the house felt different, like it had learned how to breathe again. 2 days later, Edward sat with a cup of black coffee in his hands and stared across the table at Marcus, who was sketching Rusty on a napkin. "How would you feel about school?" he asked. Marcus didn't look up. "Like what?" "A real school, a small one, not too far from here. Just a few kids, no uniforms. You'd come home every day." Marcus's hand stopped mid-sketch. "What for?" he asked. "To learn, to be around other kids, to get things that might help you later." "Most schools just make me feel more alone," Marcus said. "They put you in the back and forget your name." Edward leaned forward. "This one's different. I know the principal. She's older, been running that place for 30 years. I can talk to her. You wouldn't be a number." Marcus thought about it for a while, then shrugged. "Can Rusty come?" "Probably not in class," Edward said, smiling. "But he can be waiting outside when you're done." Marcus looked at his dog, then at Edward. "What if I mess up?" "Then we try again," Edward said. "No one's keeping score." The boy tapped the pencil against the table. "Okay, one day, I'll go. If it sucks, I'm done." "Fair enough," Edward replied, already mentally writing the email. The next morning, they visited the school. Marcus wore jeans that actually fit and a clean sweatshirt Edward had ordered online. He held onto Rusty's leash tightly as they walked through the modest brick building. Edward spoke with the principal, a kind woman named Mrs. Lambert, while Marcus sat stiffly in the waiting room. "We've got a few kids. Like him," she said softly. "They're the quiet ones, the watchers, but they come around." Edward nodded. "He just needs a place that doesn't treat him like a problem." When Mrs. Lambert greeted Marcus, she didn't extend her hand. Instead, she crouched a bit and said, "I hear you're smarter than most." "Grown men." Marcus looked at her sideways. "Who told you that?" "Someone who doesn't lie," she replied. The boy cracked a brief smile. Edward watched from the side, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. When they left, Marcus didn't say anything until they were in the truck. Then he said, "I might go again." "What changed your mind?" Edward asked. Marcus looked down at Rusty, who had climbed onto his lap. "She didn't try to fix me either." Back at the house, Edward stood at the door and watched Marcus run toward the trail with Rusty chasing after him. The boy had energy. Again, lightness in his stride that hadn't been there before. Edward felt it too, something he hadn't known how much he missed. Momentum. Jorge came up beside him, wiping his hands on a rag. "He's starting to trust you," he said. Edward nodded. "I know. That's not nothing," Jorge added. Edward smiled faintly. It's everything. Inside, the chessboard waited on the table, and beside it sat the napkin Marcus had left behind. The sketch of Rusty was unfinished, but the outline was enough. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. And for now, that was more than Edward had thought he'd ever have. Again. Why do you keep drawing that same thing? Edward asked, his eyes locked on the sheet of paper in Marcus's hands. The boy had been sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the coffee table for over an hour, sketching with a mechanical pencil Edward had given him a few days earlier. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He finished outlining the jagged shape of a vehicle's twisted front bumper before flipping the pencil in his hand and shading in the shattered windshield. The drawing was crude, but the intention was unmistakable. A car, flipped on its side. Two stick figures, one larger, one smaller, trapped inside. Rusty rested beside the boy, snoring softly. Edward sat stiffly on the couch, a book on his lap he hadn't turned a page of in nearly 20 minutes. It's just something I remember, Marcus said, still not looking up. From when? Edward pressed, his voice firm but not harsh. Marcus finally set the pencil down and looked up. From a long time ago. I was real little. Edward leaned forward slightly. Do you remember what happened? I wasn't in it, Marcus said quickly. I was watching. From the woods, the car crashed and nobody else saw it. But I did. Edward didn't. Speak at first. The sound of Marcus's voice, quiet but certain, wasn't something he was used to yet. The boy rarely volunteered information about his past. Everything Edward had learned so far had come in fragments. A shelter here, a temporary school there, a night in a stranger's garage, a week. Sleeping under an overpass. But now, the way Marcus spoke had weight, the kind of weight that came from memory, not imagination. Edward stood and walked to the edge of the table, picking up the drawing carefully. The image wasn't detailed, but it was almost identical to the wreckage he had seen with his own eyes. The same angle of the flipped car, the same lopsided tree beside the road, even the same slope on which the vehicle had landed. Do you remember where this happened? Edward asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Marcus shrugged. Near a bend in the road, dirt path nearby. My mom and I were walking. We heard it, then saw it happen. I tried to run over, but she pulled me back, said we couldn't help, said it wasn't safe. Edward's hands trembled as he set the paper down. He didn't tell Marcus then, but he had a feeling, an awful, crawling certainty that they were talking about the same night. Marcus leaned back and stretched his legs, grabbing a cookie from the plate between them and biting into it slowly. After that, she stopped talking for a while, he said. She'd just look at the ground a lot. And when I asked about the people in the car, she said they probably got help. But I remember the smoke. I remember how quiet it got after the crash. Edward sat down again, trying not to let the weight of the moment show in his face. Did you ever see any pictures of it? On TV? In a newspaper? He asked. Marcus shook his head. We never stayed anywhere long enough. And she didn't let me watch news, said it was full of liars. The boy rubbed his forehead with his sleeve, smudging graphite on his skin. I just draw it sometimes so I don't forget. I don't know why. It's like it doesn't want me to forget. Edward swallowed hard. Maybe you remember because it mattered, he said. Marcus looked at him sideways. I didn't know the people, just saw them, that's all. But Edward couldn't let it go. He knew in his bones this wasn't just a coincidence. The details were too exact, the timing too perfect. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed and Rusty had curled up at the boy's feet, Edward sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the drawing. He retrieved the police report from the drawer in his study, the one he had filed away years ago, but never thrown out. Opening the manila envelope with unsteady fingers, he laid the report beside the drawing. The resemblance was jarring. The position of the trees, the shape of the car, even the detail of a broken road sign. Marcus had included it all from memory. Edward exhaled through his nose and ran his fingers over the names printed on the report. Charles Langston, Abigail Langston. Time of death, 7:46. PM, cause blunt force trauma. Edward pressed his eyes shut for a moment, forcing the emotion back. The report had always felt sterile, clean, but the drawing made it real again. It meant that Marcus had seen his son die, that the boy had been a witness, not just to tragedy, but to Edward's personal collapse. And if Marcus had been there, then Angela had too. That realization sparked something sharper, something more complicated than grief. Guilt, yes, but also something darker, suspicion. The next morning, Edward watched Marcus from across the field as the boy and Rusty chased each other in loose circles, laughing as the dog barked playfully and leaped forward. For a moment, the darkness in Edward's chest lifted. Marcus was still a child after all, and despite everything he had endured, he could still laugh. But Edward's mind kept circling back to the drawing, to the facts, to the timeline. He needed more than guesses. He needed confirmation. But how could he ask Marcus? The boy barely trusted the world as it was. Asking about that night, pushing him to remember more, might unravel the fragile trust they had built. When Marcus came back, panting and grinning, Edward forced a smile. "You wore him out," he said, nodding toward Rusty, who was now sprawled on the porch, tongue hanging out. Marcus dropped to the ground beside the dog. "He always wins. I just pretend like I don't notice." Edward sat beside them on the steps. "Marcus," he said carefully, "do you remember the people in the car? What they looked like?" Marcus looked up, his smile fading slightly. "Not really. I just remember they didn't move. The man had blood on his shirt. The woman's head was turned funny." Edward nodded slowly, stomach twisting. It was them. For the next few days, Edward said nothing more about the crash. Instead, he observed Marcus with a renewed sense of urgency, searching for anything, any word, gesture, or slip that might tell him more. He didn't want to believe what he was beginning to suspect, but the thought clawed at the back of his mind. What if Angela had known who was in that car? What if she had chosen not to help? Worse, what if she had fled because she recognized them? He couldn't prove any of it yet, but the coincidence was too exact. He started asking gentle questions. "Where did you and your mom go after that day?" Marcus answered with vague shrugs. "Don't. No, just moved around. Sometimes shelters, sometimes motels. I don't think she liked staying in one place too long." Edward tried not to push. He offered more drawing paper instead. Marcus took it gratefully and began sketching again. This time, a tree line, a road, a shoe lying by the ditch. Images kept coming, and each one made Edward's chest tighten. He wasn't sure whether the boy was remembering or reliving. And worst of all, he wasn't sure how much Marcus truly understood about what he had seen that day. One night, Edward walked past Marcus's door and saw the boy asleep, one arm hanging off the bed, fingers still holding a pencil. The latest drawing lay on the floor beside him, a man's silhouette standing over a wreck. But this time, there was a child watching from the bushes. The detail was unmistakable. The child was him. Marcus was beginning to remember more. Edward knew the time for silence was running out. The boy wasn't just part of his present, he was entangled in the past Edward had tried to bury. The truth, long buried under grief and denial, was coming back in pencil lines and broken sentences. And Edward realized with a hollow ache in his chest that if he ever wanted peace, for Marcus or for himself, he would have to find Angela. He had to know what she saw, what she did, and why she disappeared. Because something more than coincidence had brought Marcus to him. Something had tied their tragedies together, and if he didn't uncover it soon, it might destroy the fragile life they were both trying to rebuild. "I need you to help me find someone," Edward said, standing in the middle of Jorge's workshop, gripping a folder tightly in one hand. Jorge glanced up from the engine he was working on and raised an eyebrow. Someone? Or something? Edward's tone left no room for play. Her name is Angela. Marcus's mother? Jorge set his wrench down. You finally ready to talk about what this is really about? Edward walked forward and placed the folder on the workbench. Inside were photocopies of police reports, newspaper clippings, and Marcus's drawings, arranged in a way that told a story only Edward had begun to understand. I think she was there the night my son died. I think Marcus saw the crash, maybe even saw them die, but he didn't know who they were. He still doesn't. He was a child living in a trailer off the highway. He saw the wreck, and Angela pulled him away before anyone showed up. Jorge flipped through the papers, his expression shifting from mild confusion to uneasy realization. And you want to confront her? No, Edward said. I want answers. I want to know why she ran, why she never said anything, and what the hell she's been hiding. The investigation started quietly, without involving law enforcement or any official channels. Edward didn't want Marcus exposed to unnecessary trauma, nor did he want to risk Angela disappearing again the moment she felt watched. Jorge contacted a friend who still worked in municipal records, someone who owed him a favor from years, back when they both handled construction permits across rural Montana. Over a series of days, the friend pulled utility records, school enrollments, and hospital visits connected to a woman named Angela who matched the sparse information they had. No last name, no birth date, just a consistent pattern. One woman, one child, rarely staying in one place more than a few months. Eventually, they found a trail that led to Wyoming. A clinic in Rock Springs had an emergency room intake from 7 years ago. A woman named Angela brought in a boy under the name M. Holloway, treated for dehydration. No insurance, no follow-up, and the listed phone number was disconnected. But it was enough. Edward stared at the printout with a hollow expression. That's them, he said. That has to be them. Jorge gave a slow nod. You want to drive out there? Edward didn't answer immediately. Then quietly, no. I want to find her without spooking her. For days, Edward wrestled with the weight of what he'd uncovered. He said nothing to Marcus, though the boy clearly sensed a shift. He had grown used to Edward's attention, whether it was during their chess games, walks with Rusty, or evening conversations at the table. But now Edward was quieter, distracted. Marcus asked once, "You mad at me?" And Edward had shaken his head immediately, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Never," he said. "I'm just thinking too much." Still, the distance lingered. Marcus spent more time alone, returning to his drawings, but avoiding the subject of the accident. Edward didn't press. He knew that any confrontation with Angela needed to happen carefully. So he reached out to another contact, Carol Henley, a retired social worker who had once worked with children in mobile housing communities. Carol agreed to meet at a neutral cafe, where Edward explained everything: Marcus, the drawings, the accident, and the suspicion that Angela had run because she knew more than she ever admitted. Carol listened quietly, then said, "There's a woman in Jackson Hole, works part-time at a motel, matches your Angela's profile, keeps to herself, hasn't mentioned a kid in years. I think that's your ghost." Edward flew to Jackson Hole the next morning, telling Marcus only that he had a doctor's appointment in another town. Jorge stayed behind to keep the boy company. The motel was older, paint peeling. From the wooden siding, the sign half lit. Edward walked into the front office and asked for a room, then waited in the lot, watching. Hours passed. Finally, a woman stepped outside to empty a trash can. Dark skin, tired posture, her movements guarded. Edward's heart stalled. It was her, older, thinner, hair pulled into a tight bun, but he would never forget the face. He approached slowly, and she looked up. Their eyes met, She froze. The trash bag slipped from her hands. "Angela?" he asked. She didn't respond. "I'm not here to hurt you," he added. "I'm here because of Marcus." Her knees nearly buckled, and she caught herself on the edge of the bin. "You found him?" she whispered. "He's with you." Edward stepped closer. "He's safe. He saved me. And I need to understand why you disappeared that night, why you never came forward." Angela looked around, visibly panicking. "Not here," she said quickly. "Follow me. We can't talk out in the open." Inside a small maintenance room behind the motel, Angela paced while Edward sat on a crate. "I didn't know who they were," she said. "I swear to you, I saw the crash. We were living nearby in a trailer a mile off the highway. Marcus heard the noise and ran. I followed. When I saw the wreck, I panicked. The boy was screaming, trying to get to the car. I held him back. There was smoke. I didn't see movement inside. I thought they were dead." Edward clenched his fists but stayed calm. "Why didn't you call for help?" She stopped, pacing. "Because I had a warrant. Nothing big, just unpaid fines, but I knew what happened to women like me when the cops got involved. I had Marcus to think about. I couldn't risk losing him." Edward's voice was low. "So you vanished." "I had to," she said, "and then it was too late. I thought about coming forward 100 times, but what good would it do? The papers said they died on impact. There was nothing I could have done." Edward leaned forward. "You could have told him. He's been drawing that crash for years. He remembered." Angela's voice cracked. "I know. I see it in his eyes. Every damn day." Edward stayed another hour asking questions, where they'd been, why she never trusted anyone, how she kept Marcus hidden. Angela answered with shame but never avoided the truth. "I messed up," she admitted, "but I never stopped loving him. I did what I thought would keep him safest. I thought being invisible would protect us." Edward didn't respond right away. Then he said, "You didn't just vanish. You took something from him, a chance to grieve properly, a chance to be seen." Angela lowered her head. "Can I see him?" she asked. Edward hesitated. "Maybe, but not now. He doesn't know this story, not all of it, and he trusts me. I'm not going to shatter that trust until I'm sure he's ready." Angela nodded slowly. "Then tell him I'm alive, and that I never wanted to leave him." Edward stood to go. "I'll tell him when the time's right." As he walked out of the motel, he realized something inside him had shifted. The anger had burned off. All that was left was the weight of the truth and the question of whether Marcus would survive knowing it. "You're sure it's her?" Jorge asked, pulling the truck into the gas station's side lot. Edward didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the woman inside, mopping the tile floor in slow, methodical movements. Her posture was tired, her back slightly hunched, and her clothes loose from years of wear. But he recognized her. It wasn't just the face, it was the way she moved, how she tilted her head to avoid eye contact, how her hands gripped the mop handle like it was the only solid thing in the world. "It's her," Edward finally said. Jorge glanced at him. "You want me to come in?" "No," Edward replied. "This is between me and her." He stepped out of the truck with measured effort, walking through the side door of the station and stopping a few feet from where she stood. She noticed him immediately. The mop dropped with a wet slap, and she backed away, her expression wild with recognition. "You," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "It's you." Edward didn't move. "I'm not here to hurt you." She took another step back, pressing herself against the wall near the restrooms. "Where's Marcus?" "He's safe," Edward said. "He's with me." Angela's hands began to shake. "Oh God. I didn't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear to you, I didn't know it was your son." Edward didn't flinch. He stood rooted, his cane lightly tapping the edge of a shelf. "So you admit it?" he asked. "You were driving the car that night?" She nodded, barely able to look at him. "I was tired." We'd been driving for hours. Marcus had been sick, and I was trying to get to the next town where I thought we could find a clinic. I turned to check on him in the back seat just for a second, and when I looked back at the road, there they were. Headlights. Too close. I swerved. Her hands were now gripping the counter behind her, knuckles white. I hit them. I didn't mean to. I didn't even know if I hit them or if they hit me. But I saw the crash. I saw the fire starting. I knew someone had died, and I panicked. Edward's jaw clenched. And instead of calling for help, you ran. Angela nodded. Slowly. I grabbed Marcus and ran into the woods. We watched from behind a tree. I told him it wasn't safe to go near it, that people were coming. Then we just disappeared. Why didn't you come forward after? Edward asked, his voice tight but calm. Angela swallowed hard. Because I was scared. I had warrants. I'd been homeless. I thought they'd take Marcus away. I didn't know who was in that car. I thought if I waited long enough, maybe no one would ever trace it back to me. There were no cameras, no plate readers. It was a miracle. Edward shook his head. A miracle? He repeated. You think what happened that night was a miracle? Angela stepped forward slightly. No, I think Marcus surviving it was. I think the fact that he didn't see the worst of it, didn't see the fire engulf the wreck, didn't see the faces of the people inside, that was a miracle. I shielded him. I didn't protect them, but I protected him. Edward's face hardened. He's been drawing it for years. That's how much you shielded him. Angela closed her eyes. I know. I live with it every day. Every time he wakes up screaming, I wonder if this is the day he remembers everything. And every time he asks. About that night, I lie. Because I didn't know how to tell him I was the reason they died. You weren't the reason they died, Edward said suddenly, and Angela looked up in confusion. What? He took a deep breath. I never told anyone this. Not the police, not the media. But my son, Charles, he'd been drinking that night. He and his wife had been fighting. I found the toxicology report after the funeral. He was twice the legal limit. I buried it, paid to keep it quiet. I didn't want his legacy tarnished. Angela's mouth parted, stunned. So, he was at fault too? Edward nodded. Maybe. We'll never know for sure. But what I do know is that you made a decision that night to save your son. I made one to protect the memory of mine. And now here we are. She stared at him, breathing unevenly. So what do you want from me? She asked. Punishment? An apology? Do you want to drag me into a court? Put me on the news? Edward shook his head. No, I'm not here for revenge. I came because Marcus deserves to know the truth, eventually, but only when he's ready, and only if it won't destroy him. Angela lowered her eyes. You think he'd hate me? Edward didn't answer. He couldn't. I just wanted him safe, she whispered, barely audible. I didn't care about me. I just needed to keep him breathing, keep him out of the system. I've seen what happens to boys like him. They get swallowed whole. I couldn't let that happen. Edward's tone softened. And yet you've let him carry the weight of something you never explained. He thought he was just a witness, but he's been living in the shadow of something much bigger. Angela looked away, ashamed. He looked so happy that day. The day he met you. He talked about you for weeks after it happened. I never saw him light up like that before. And then you were gone and he changed, closed up. I knew I'd taken something from him again. Edward stepped closer. He needs stability now. A future. Not more running. So if you care about him truly, you'll let me handle how and when this truth comes out. You stay hidden for now. But I need to know that when the time comes, you'll be ready to answer his questions. Angela met his eyes. I'll be there, she said. No matter what he asks, I'll answer. Edward left the station without another word, returning to the truck where Jorge waited, engine running. So? Jorge asked. It was her. Edward confirmed. She admitted it? Yes. What are you going to do? Edward stared ahead, eyes unreadable. Nothing. Not yet. Jorge nodded slowly, knowing better than to push. "And Marcus?" he asked. "He doesn't know. Not the truth. Not yet." Edward leaned back against the seat. "But he will. And when he does, it has to come from me." As they pulled away from the gas station, Angela stepped outside and watched them disappear into the road. She didn't wave. She didn't move. She simply stood there, frozen, in a moment she knew would change everything. Edward, meanwhile, clutched the edge of his seat, his mind already rehearsing the day he'd have to look Marcus in the eye and tell him what his mother had done, and what he himself had chosen to hide. But for now, he returned to the boy who still trusted him, carrying a secret heavy enough to fracture the fragile foundation they'd built. And in that silence, Edward knew the real weight wasn't the truth itself, but whether love could survive it. "Don't open the gate," Jorge warned as he peered through the curtain. "They've been parked out there since 6 this morning, 2 SUVs and that white van with the satellite dish." Edward didn't move from his seat. He sat in the armchair near the fireplace, hands folded, eyes trained on the TV that wasn't even turned on. Marcus sat on the floor, hugging Rusty, his face pale and blank. The boy hadn't spoken much since the article broke, since the photo of him walking beside Edward hand in hand had plastered itself across every major news outlet. The headline read, "Black Child Saves Recluse. Billionaire, then truth about his mother explodes." Edward had read it once, then tossed the paper into the trash. But the damage was done. The calls hadn't stopped since. Former business partners demanding statements, donors threatening to pull funding from Edward's community programs. Anonymous voicemails warning him to cut ties before he ruins what's left of your legacy. Jorge muted the landline and disconnected the doorbell camera. "They'll run out of steam," he muttered. "Eventually they'll chase another story." Edward didn't respond. He was waiting for Marcus to ask him what it meant, for him to ask if everything they had built was about to fall apart. "I'm not leaving," Marcus said flatly, breaking the heavy silence. "I don't care what they say." Edward turned toward him slowly. "You're not safe here anymore," he said. "They know where you are. They know your name. And, worse, they know hers." Marcus stood, arms tight around his chest. "I don't care." Edward softened his voice. "Marcus, listen to me. You've spent your whole life running. I won't let you do it again, not because of something you didn't choose." The boy shook his head. "They're calling her a murderer. They're saying she killed your son." Edward stood now, wincing from the pressure on his hip. "And I'm telling them they're wrong." "But she did hit them, didn't she?" Marcus asked. "She was there. She ran." Edward stepped closer, and Charles was drunk. No one's hands were clean that night, but no one intended to kill anyone. Marcus swallowed hard. "So now what? Do I have to go live with her again?" Edward paused. "She wanted to run. She thought it was the only way to protect you." "She's wrong," Marcus said. "This is the only place I've ever felt normal. And I'm not leaving, not even for her." It was the first time he'd spoken with such finality, such certainty. Edward felt a lump rise in his throat, but nodded firmly. Jorge returned from the kitchen with a burner phone and handed it to Edward. They called again. "That TV station from New York want an exclusive. They say they'll pay 6 figures if you let them interview the boy." Edward snatched the phone and shut it off. "They're not getting within 10 miles of him." Jorge hesitated, then sat down. "What about your board? You know, half those guys never liked you. This gives them leverage." Edward leaned on the table. "They can take the damn company if they want. I'm not making a child explain his mother's mistakes just so my investors feel morally secure." Marcus listened silently, absorbing every word. He had spent a lifetime being ignored by adults, by systems, by the world. Now for the first time, 2 grown men were defending him without him even asking. He sat down beside Rusty and pulled the dog into his lap. "Can't we just go somewhere else?" he asked. "A place where nobody knows us?" Edward crouched beside him. "We could, but you'd still know. Running doesn't erase what happened. Staying means fighting for the life we've built. You said this was your home. That means we protect it." Marcus nodded slowly, eyes hardening with resolve. The next day, the school called. "We can't have Marcus on campus right now," the principal said awkwardly. "There's media at the front gate. We've had complaints from parents. They're worried about safety." Edward clenched the receiver. "He's 9, he said, and he's done nothing wrong. I understand, Mr. Langston, but until this dies down, maybe homeschooling is an option." Edward hung up without answering. He found Marcus on the back porch, Rusty asleep at his feet. "You've been suspended," Edward said quietly. "They don't want you back until the reporters disappear." Marcus didn't react. "That's fine," he said. "School was boring anyway." Edward sat beside him. "They're scared. Not of you. Of what you represent. People like to pretend. Accidents are neat. With villains and victims. This doesn't fit their story." Marcus looked at him, eyes narrowed. "Then we make a new story." Edward raised an eyebrow. "What kind of story?" "One where I don't run. One where people like me get to stay put. One where you don't lose another son." Edward inhaled slowly, his chest tight. "You're not my son," he said, his voice raw. "I know," Marcus said softly, "but I'd like to be." Angela called later that evening. Her voice was tight, brittle. "They were at my job," she said. "2 men with cameras. They followed me all the way to the bus. Stop. I had to jump off 3 stops early." Edward kept his voice calm. "Are you safe now?" "Yes, but I can't go back there. I'll lose everything, even the tiny life I've made." "Marcus doesn't want to leave," Edward said. "He chose to stay." Angela went silent for a moment. Then, "He chose you." "He chose a place that didn't make him feel like a mistake," Edward corrected. "He chose the truth, and he chose not to run." Angela choked back a sound. "I don't blame him. I don't know who I am to him anymore." "You're still his mother," Edward said, "but right now he needs space to be something more than someone's mistake." Angela whispered, "Take care of him." "I am," Edward replied, "and you'll get your chance again, but only when he's ready." After the call, Edward stood on the porch for a long time. Marcus joined him minutes later, standing close but not speaking. They didn't need words. Not that night. The following morning, Edward held a press conference on his own terms. No cameras, no microphones, just a short written statement read in front of a few reporters gathered at the edge of the property line. "Marcus is a child. He did not ask for this spotlight. He saved my life. His mother made mistakes, as we all have, but she is not a villain, and I will not let my grief be weaponized to punish them." He turned and walked away before anyone could ask questions. Back at the house, Marcus had watched it all from the upstairs window. When Edward came inside, the boy met him at the bottom of the stairs. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Edward rested a hand on the railing. "Yes, I did." Marcus looked up at him. "So what now?" "Now," Edward said, "we keep living and we stop letting other people write our story for us." Marcus nodded. "Can I go back to drawing?" "Only if I get to hang them on the wall," Edward replied. The boy smiled. For the first time since the news broke, it was real. That night after dinner, Marcus taped a new drawing to the fridge. It wasn't of the accident. It wasn't of his mother. It was a sketch of the house, small, rough, but clear. The porch, the barn, even Rusty curled up under a tree, and beside it 2 figures, one tall with a cane, one smaller holding a leash. Above them, written in blocky pencil letters, was a single word: home. Edward stood beside him, silent. Marcus glanced at him. "You think it'll ever be normal again?" Edward didn't answer right away. He looked at the drawing, then at the boy, and finally said, "Maybe not normal, but real? Yes. And that's enough." For both of them, it was. "I need to tell you something," Edward said, as he sat across from Marcus at the kitchen table, hands clasped tightly together. The boy looked up from his cereal, his spoon pausing mid-air. "You look like you're about to fire someone," Marcus muttered. Edward almost smiled, but the gravity of what he was about to say stopped him. "It's about my son, about Charles." Marcus set the spoon down and leaned back, arms crossed, his expression guarded but curious. Edward exhaled and started. "The night of the accident. The night your mother's car hit them. Charles had been drinking. He wasn't supposed to drive, but he did. He got behind the wheel with his wife and they were arguing. The toxicology report showed he was twice the legal limit." Marcus didn't say anything, but his eyes didn't move from Edward's. "I paid to suppress the report," Edward continued. "I was afraid of what it would do to his name. He was a public figure, in line for big projects. I thought if people knew, it would undo everything he worked for." Marcus blinked slowly. "So it wasn't just her fault?" "No," Edward said. "It never was. They both made terrible decisions, and both families paid the price." Marcus's lips tightened, and he looked down at the table. "So all this time, everyone blamed her." "Because I let them," Edward admitted. "I buried the truth and let the world create its own villain. It was easier than facing how badly I'd failed as a father. I was so angry at her for running, but I did the same thing in a different way. I ran from the truth." Marcus nodded slowly, processing. "Are you going to tell people?" "Yes," Edward said. "All of them. Even if it ruins your name?" "Especially if it does," Edward answered. He reached across the table and placed a hand on Marcus's. "If I don't stand up. Now everything we've built together, this house, this peace, it's all a lie." Marcus looked up again, his eyes sharper now. "You think they'll believe you?" "I don't care if they do," Edward said, "but they'll hear it from me, and Angela won't be hunted anymore, not for something we all had a hand in." The boy nodded once, then pushed the cereal away. "Then I'll be there when you do it." Edward was silent for a moment. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "You stood up for me. It's my turn." The following day, Edward contacted a small but respected local journalist he trusted, someone who had once covered his philanthropic projects before his retreat from public life. The journalist, Carla Nunes, agreed to meet in person and promised a private, recorded interview. When she arrived at the house, her expression was cautious, professional. "I assume you understand what you're doing," she said, voice low as she set up her equipment. "This story won't just shake a few heads. It could destroy your entire legacy." Edward nodded. "It's not about legacy anymore. It's about truth." Carla glanced at Marcus, who stood in the background near the doorway, arms folded, silent but firm. "He's the reason you're doing this?" she asked. "He's the reason I stopped hiding," Edward replied. As the camera started rolling, he took a breath and began speaking, not from notes, but from memory. "Years ago, I lost my son and daughter-in-law in a car crash. I blamed the woman who fled the scene, who didn't call for help. But what I never told anyone was that my son had been drinking. He was at fault too. I paid to bury the evidence because I didn't want to see him dragged through the mud." Carla didn't interrupt. She just let the camera roll. "Her name is Angela," Edward continued, voice steady. "She ran because she thought the system wouldn't protect her or her child, and maybe she was right, but she's not a criminal. She didn't leave because of malice. She left because she was terrified, and she saved her son in the process. That son is Marcus. He saved me years later without knowing who I was, and I owe him my life." When the recording ended, Carla turned off the camera and exhaled slowly. "You're not leaving anything out," she said. "No spin? None, Edward answered. You'll get the full story. Publish it as it is. Marcus stepped forward. If people ask me questions, I'll answer them. I'm not ashamed anymore. Carla looked between the two of them, visibly moved. It'll run tomorrow morning, she said, and I'll make sure they hear it in your words, not the headlines. After she left, Edward turned to Marcus. Are you all right? The boy shrugged. Depends what happens next. We face it together, Edward said. Whatever it is, Marcus nodded. Okay then, let them come. When the article was published the next day, the response was instantaneous. Social media lit up, but this time the tone had shifted. Where there had been blame, there was now curiosity. Some praised Edward's bravery, others criticized him for waiting so long, but the narrative had changed. The spotlight dimmed on Angela, replaced by a broader discussion about accountability, grief, and systemic failure. Donations resumed for Edward's foundation, but he redirected them toward a new initiative, one focused on legal aid and support for children in unstable housing conditions, named the Holloway Project, in honor of the alias Angela had used for years. Marcus watched it all unfold without the fear that had once shadowed his every step. The kids at school treated him differently, some with respect, others with envy, but no one avoided him anymore. When his teacher asked him to give a short presentation on courage, he stood in front of the class, voice firm, and said, "Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about deciding who you want to be when everyone's looking." Edward sat in the back that day, unseen by most, but heard in every word. Angela returned to town weeks later, invited quietly by Edward. The reunion with Marcus wasn't immediate. She waited outside the house while Edward asked the boy what he wanted to do. "She's not perfect," he said. "Neither are you. Neither am I." Marcus took a long breath and said, "Then let's be not perfect together." He stepped out to the porch and faced her. Angela's eyes filled with tears. She didn't reach for him. She waited. Marcus closed the distance and wrapped his arms around her waist. She broke. Down completely, knees buckling, and he held her up just like she had done for him so many times when he was too small to remember. From the doorway, Edward watched quietly, his heart tight. Jorge stood beside him. "You did it," Jorge said softly. "No," Edward replied. "We did it." And he made the final choice. That night, the three of them shared dinner together for the first time. The conversation was cautious, but real. Angela asked questions about school. Marcus told her about Rusty's latest trick. Edward talked about the garden they were trying to rebuild. It wasn't a celebration, it was something better, a beginning. Later that evening, Marcus pulled Edward aside while Angela washed dishes. "You still miss him?" he asked. Edward didn't need to ask who. "Every day," he said. "But now, when I think of him, I don't just feel pain." Marcus nodded. "You think he'd be mad?" Edward shook his head. "No, I think he'd be grateful you reminded me what it means to be a father." Marcus looked at him quietly for a moment, then said, "So what do we do now?" Edward smiled. "Now we make this a real home. Not just a place to survive, a place to live." Marcus grinned. "Then you better start teaching me how to fix that tractor. It still makes that weird noise." Edward laughed. "Deal." From that point forward, they stopped looking back as often. The past didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled the room. And the road ahead, though uncertain, was finally theirs to walk together. "Sign your name right there," Edward said, pointing to the final page of the packet laid out on the dining room table. Marcus stared at the line for a moment, his pen hovering above the paper. "What exactly does this mean?" he asked, glancing over at Jorge, who stood nearby, arms crossed with a knowing smile. Edward leaned back in his chair, his breathing a bit heavier than usual, but his eyes still sharp. "It means, when I'm gone, the house is yours. The land, the foundation. Everything. You'll have full control of the education center, and your name will be attached to the future of this, a place as much as mine or Charles's. Marcus looked at him carefully. But I'm not your blood. Neither was Jorge, Edward said, gesturing to the man beside him. And neither were the kids you're going to help someday. Family's not about blood, Marcus. It's about what you build with someone and what you leave behind. Marcus swallowed hard, then finally signed. Edward didn't say anything as he watched the pen move across the paper, but Jorge saw the slight tremble in his old friend's hands and the way his eyes glistened as the ink dried. It was done. The Charles Langston Rural Initiative. Officially launched 4 months later, the first classes were small, just 6 students, but they came from shelters, foster homes, and juvenile systems across the region. Some were barely literate, others had bounced between too many schools to count, but all of them arrived with the same guarded eyes. Marcus had once carried. Angela took a quiet administrative role, handling supplies and scheduling. Jorge helped with transport and repairs. Marcus, still only a teenager, became the face of the program. Not because Edward told him to, but because the kids trusted him. He'd lived it. He knew what hunger felt like, what it meant to sleep light and wake up faster than you should, and he knew the power of being seen. Edward watched the growth from the porch most days, sitting with Rusty. Older now, slower, his once golden-brown coat now streaked with white. The dog still followed Marcus from classroom to garden and lay near the children during story time. Rusty had become more than a pet. He was a reminder to every child who entered that survival was possible, and that loyalty left a mark deeper than any scar. One morning, Edward called Marcus into the study. It wasn't urgent, just something he said he'd been meaning to do. Marcus found him going through boxes of old photographs and papers, sorting through decades of memories. "There's a letter I wrote," Edward said without looking up. "For you. It's in that drawer. Don't open it now. Save it for when I'm not around." Marcus didn't answer right away. "Are you okay?" he asked. Edward smiled faintly. "Old, tired, happy. That's about as much as anyone can ask for." Marcus walked to the drawer and opened it. The letter was sealed, with his name written in the familiar, neat script Edward always used. He placed it in his backpack without comment. "You think the kids will keep coming?" he asked. Edward looked at him. "They'll keep coming as long as you don't give up. The world has more invisible children than it knows what to do with. You'll be their mirror, their map." Marcus shifted his weight. "And when I mess up, then you get up. You don't wait for permission. You remember how you got here and who you are now." That was all Edward needed to say. Marcus understood. Years passed with quiet consistency. The initiative grew slowly, deliberately. A greenhouse was built, then a second classroom, then a dormitory for those who couldn't go home. Marcus studied remotely, earned credentials, and never stopped drawing. His sketches hung on the walls, some rough, some vivid, some beautiful in their imperfection. Rusty passed away during a quiet winter night, curled up in his favorite spot near the back steps. The next morning, the children held a memorial. They painted a mural of him on the eastern wall, tongue out, tail wagging, beside a boy with his arm around him. Angela cried for days. Marcus buried Rusty beneath the apple tree where he used to nap. Edward, already weaker, didn't speak much that week. But the day after the burial, he told Jorge he'll be fine now. It wasn't a prediction. It was a declaration. He'd seen Marcus become something the world tried to prevent. Stable, respected, selfless. The boy who once slept behind dumpsters was now running something that mattered. Edward passed away 6 months later, peacefully at home. His will was executed as written. Marcus received everything. The ceremony was small, no press, no spectacle, just the people who mattered. Former students returned as adults, some now working in non-profits, some teaching, some just living better lives than the ones they'd escaped. They spoke quietly of what Edward had meant to them, even if they'd never met him directly. Angela read a passage from one of Edward's journals. Jorge stood behind her, proud and tearful. Marcus didn't speak during the ceremony, but afterward he returned to the study, opened the drawer one last time, and read the letter Edward had left. It was personal, raw, full of words Edward never spoke aloud. It ended simply, "You saved me more than I saved you. That is your legacy, Marcus. Not what you suffered, but what you gave back." Marcus folded the letter and placed it beside the photograph of Rusty and Edward that now sat on the desk. The room felt smaller without him, but not empty. 10 years later, the Charles Langston Rural Initiative operated across 5 counties, with more than 200 students enrolled annually. It had reading programs, mentorship, pipelines, and scholarship tracks. The main office had been expanded, and on the back wall hung side by side were 2 portraits. One of Edward in his armchair, eyes steady and proud, the other of Rusty, painted in soft tones, always watching. Marcus, now in his late 20s, gave lectures, wrote articles, and visited state legislatures to advocate for children with backgrounds like his. But he always came home to the original house. He kept the porch furniture the same. The apple tree still stood, and every spring the children helped clean Rusty's resting place. No matter how big the program got, Marcus made sure every kid knew why it existed. It wasn't about rescuing them, it was about showing them they were never broken to begin with. One evening, after a long day at the center, Marcus walked into the office and sat behind Edward's old desk. A child's drawing sat on top, crayon, lines forming a boy with big ears and a happy dog. He pinned it beside the older ones. Then he looked at the portraits, adjusted his tie and whispered, "I still see you." Behind him, a knock at the door. Another child, another life about to change. He stood, smiled, and opened the door. "Welcome," he said. "You're home." This story was created with a lot of care, thinking especially of you, someone who values every moment and emotion. If it touched your heart, share your thoughts with us in the comments. What part moved you the most? And please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. It truly helps us keep bringing you stories like this, which take days to craft with the dedication you deserve. Your support means everything to us. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next video.